So we're here at Duxford, and behind me is the F4M as well as the MiG-21 PF. These are British and Hungarian versions of these aircraft. However, these aircraft types, of course, saw combat over Vietnam and squared off in that famous duel towards the end of that conflict. We can, at this point, of course, go through all of the duels and the technical specifications of the aircraft, but air battles aren't fought on paper. So let's look at the operational realities and explain why a small number of MiG-21s somehow managed to challenge American air power over Vietnam. So during the Vietnam War, we can of course look at many different phases. We're going to be concentrating, however, on that trailing edge of the conflict, 1970 to 1972. At this point in time, North Vietnam is still focusing mainly on air interception with very little air-to-ground activity. Why is this? Well, the simple answer is because that's what they were given. They were reliant on imports from the Soviet Union and China when they came to building up their air force, both in terms of equipment and the operational procedures, structures and systems that were put in place. So they got MiG-17s, MiG-19s, and then later on MiG-21s. And as they're being initiated into all things aviation and building up their air force, they really have to focus with the small amount of equipment they have, as well as the small cadre of pilots that they have, on the most crucial of mission sets, and that is control of the air. Now, there is no way that the North Vietnamese can actually comprehensively challenge American air power. The imbalance is, in terms of equipment, crews, and just the resources that are behind all of this, is just too great. However, what they can do is contest American air power and start probing the American strike packages and drive up the cost in terms of the operational cost, crew fatigue, equipment fatigue, and also the dollar value that's behind all of this for the Americans, to put them on the back foot and really require additional resources to be invested, and that drives up the cost for the Americans. Now at this point, of course, while the Americans are countering with ever larger formations, you have screening cap, you have chaff mules, you have wild weasel, you have the MiG cap as well, in order to combat both the ground-based SAM sites that North Vietnamese have, as well as the threat from the MiGs. We are starting to see that this system of challenging and probing and striking at their leisure against the American formation really drives up that cost. So let's familiarize ourselves with our contestants then. The MiG-21 and the F4, they're very different machines indeed. The MiG-21 that's behind me right here, that's an interceptor. What it's meant to do is scramble, climb fast, go fast, intercept, basically shoot its missiles, engage in a little bit of a dogfight, and then fly back and repeat. And for this, it is equipped basically with one engine, the Tumansky R25, and that has around about 9,000 pounds of thrust, and once you hit it into full afterburner, you're getting there into the 15,000 pounds of thrust. And in terms of armament, it's got a cannon, a 23mm cannon, as well as missiles. Specifically here, the North Vietnamese would also use the K-13. And that's a short-range IR homing air-to-air missiles. And often what they would do is they would fly towards the Americans, get into a favorable position, fire their missiles, and immediately disengage, not really engaging in that combat. Although if they did, the MiG-21 is very maneuverable, and it is quite a good dogfighter once you compare it also to the F4. So the F4 is completely different. What America did here is they looked at the Century series of aircraft and they said, can we have all of this in one package and then some? And turns out they could. It's called the F4 Phantom II. And this is a multi-role aircraft. With that, of course, comes the ability to shoot, fire, and drop more ordnance than a MiG could ever dream of. However, at the same time, it's really pushing the boundaries of what is technologically achievable at the time. First off, you will see, of course, that at the cockpit we have two seats in tandem. We have the pilot up front and then the weapon system officer, the WISO, behind. And the WISO manages the weapons, the radar, and some of the navigational tasks for the crew, simply because of the amount of kit that was placed in here that had to be broken up between two humans to be manageable. At this point in time, we simply hadn't figured out how to simplify a lot of these processes, how to automate systems, and also miniaturize the avionics as well as the controls inside the cockpit for the crew to have minimal inputs required for anything to happen. So a lot of times when the crew had to do anything in the Phantom, they had to flick a lot of levers, a lot of switches, turn a lot of buttons and knobs, and that just would take time. So there was really a training task here for the crews to be competent with the aircraft. And beyond that, as there's of course the much publicized problem with the F-4 that initially comes out without a gun. There was misplaced trust in early missiles, specifically early radar homing missiles. They weren't up to snuff at this point yet. And as such, the aircraft and its crews really have their work cut out over Vietnam. So now that we know about the aircraft, how were they used? Well, the North Vietnamese used GCI, Ground Controlled Interceptor. This is what they adopted from the Soviet Union. And what it does is it routes the aircraft specifically on certain courses to then strike at the American formation. Now, you'd think that this is quite normal, you're just being vectored towards the Americans. However, the twist here is that in the Soviet style of GCI, we have a very high command centralization, not in the cockpit with the pilot or the flight leader, but rather on the ground. Situational awareness is built up through many radar sites, and the ground controllers then know where everything is in the air, and it's them that look for gaps in the American formation or look for favorable courses of interception, and they tell their pilots exactly what to do, what course to fly, when to turn, and even where the enemy is, at which point of course the onboard radar can also, as you get closer, pick them up, and then even at times tell them when exactly to fire their missiles and to disengage. So this is a very rigid system, but it works for the North Vietnamese. And it also at the same time maximizes the problems for the Americans because they never really know where the MiGs are coming from. Basically think of this system as like a 3D chess, where a ground controller is the one that is moving all the pieces on the chessboard rather than the individual chess pieces doing their own moves based on the situation that they see in front of them. Fundamentally, what this allowed North Vietnam to do is use their MiGs like a scalpel, going for little gaps in the American formation or drawing away specific elements, and then in that gap that has just opened up, funneling additional MiGs in there. Of course, it's good to shoot down Phantoms, and the North Vietnamese wouldn't complain if they would have done that, but overall, they don't really have to get to that point. If they can just increase the cost for the Americans in terms of increasing their formation size, in terms of fatiguing their crew and their equipment, and just getting to the point where it's no longer sustainable from the pure personnel and dollar value being invested in this, that's when they've already won. The Americans had, of course, at this point, work cut out for them, but they, of course, will adapt. So what did the Americans do in response? Well, the first thing they do is they do increase the formation size, but that in a way is what the North Vietnamese wants, and it becomes unsustainable at some point because there's a cutoff point in terms of how many aircraft you can add just from crew and equipment fatigue, as well as the dollar value that's attached to all of this. The Americans have to come up with different ways of challenging the MiGs. And what they come up with is two things: training changes and operational changes. Let's talk about the training changes first. The much publicized change is, of course, the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, or Top Gun as it's known, as well as the Air Force equivalent, with a revised curriculum in order to teach the crews how to use their craft against the more nimble Soviet-type aircraft. And that change really allows them to wrestle in the sky with the MiGs. However, if we track the changes of this revised curriculum, as well as how long it takes to retrain pilots and then rotate them into the theater, this really only starts to take effect towards the very end of the conflict. But a second training change is equally as important, but not often talked about, and that is that the crews really had to revise and relearn the aircraft that they were flying. The initial training curriculums that the Air Force, for example, had weren't enough to provide them with the fluidity and the competence to use the F-4 in the manner that it could be used, simply because those training regimes were still lagging behind the capabilities of this aircraft. And one very revealing Air Force study actually showed that when pilots and the WISOs were quizzed on what to do with the aircraft in certain situations, that most of them either couldn't do it fast enough or didn't know what to do at all. So as these training revisions came in, they started to increase the currency with the aircraft and being able to go through the motions of flicking switches, turning buttons and knobs very quickly, almost by muscle memory, rather than having to go through the process of thinking exactly what you're doing, which is going to take way too much time. So as the pilots increase their currency with the platform, there's also operational changes, and this is really important when we think about how the MiGs were used. America also had a similar ground-controlled interception system where radar data was gathered and then that data was dispersed to the strike package. However, the crucial difference is that this data was simply sent to the strike package as information rather than being attached with direct orders. There could be recommendations attached to this, but it really wasn't the way that the North Vietnamese did it, where it was very regimented and centralized command structure on the ground. But this data package for the Americans was incomplete. And it transpired that there were basically two data pools that were being gathered in parallel, but they weren't pooled into one. You had the data package from the Air Force, mainly through radar systems, and then you had the data package from the intelligence community of the Americans with a lot of electronic intelligence and signal intelligence, even tapping into North Vietnamese communications and their IFF system. And as you then were under Operation T-Ball able to pool that information, you built up almost a second-to-second situational awareness picture that greatly enhanced the ability of the Air Force to say where everything is in the sky. And the strike package leader who was in the sky and the flight leaders could then react themselves and decide what the best course of action was. And this turned them from a reactive stance previously to a more active stance where they could proactively go after the MiGs that were slowly approaching the formation and hunt them down before they ever became a threat. And it's that change, the training change and the operational change, that act in symbiosis to really enhance the America's ability to wrestle with the MiGs. And that's why we also see towards the end of the war why the kill claim tally of the Americans jumps from 2-1 to 6-1. Now nowadays we have way more information from the North Vietnamese side as well about how many aircraft they've lost, so we probably have to knock those numbers down just slightly. But if you ask any of the crews and the operators of the time, this was the big change. The hunted became the hunter. So with the changes on the American side, we start seeing the limitations in the North Vietnamese system. Basically, before they were able to engage the Americans very selectively. They didn't always have the element of surprise, they weren't always successful, but they definitely were able to challenge American air power in a far more coherent manner. Crucially, they're still reliant on the Soviet Union and China for imports and for technical innovation. And as the Americans are innovating there at pace, the North Vietnamese simply cannot keep up because they are reliant on foreign powers for the equipment they're using. There is a real threat here for the North Vietnamese of this very rigid system that is almost, one could say, as a one-trick pony in terms of air interception, not being able to adapt fast enough to the networked approach that America has. And that really changes towards 1972, the balance in the air. So what lessons can be learned from all of that? Well, the Vietnam War, of course, provides many lessons, but in terms of air power, and for this video, we're going to focus on three main ones. The first one is situational awareness is critical, both offensively and defensively speaking, in the air. You need to be able to identify and track everything that's going on in the air and build up that data pool. And the second lesson really is that once you have that data pool, you need to be able to process it and then disperse it to your warfighters on the front lines, so they can then act upon it, and they need to have also the training to be act upon it with competence and fluidity. And the third lesson really builds up on the first two, and that is, as we compare the American system to the North Vietnamese system, we see that while the North Vietnamese system is simple and effective, it also has its limits, and the rigidity of its command structure makes it very reliant on this. And as it is faced with a networked American system where pilots are given more information and can act upon this information flexibly, the North Vietnamese system is really coming to its limits. And North Vietnam here, the big problem they have is that while they tactically can still challenge American pilots in formation, they cannot adapt operationally or technologically speaking as fast as the Americans, because they have that reliance on the Soviet Union and China and can't just do it themselves. Thanks for joining me here today in Duxford. Do check out the IWM's channel for more videos like this, and you can also check out my channel, Military Aviation History, for all things air power. Have a great day and see you in the sky.